Yeah. So I know, Eric, you worked in Windows and in Xbox, and I also had the same trajectory. I worked in Windows, then went to Xbox, and then Azure also. And from outside, people may think it's one Microsoft, but inside Microsoft, they are different, almost different companies.
Yes,
So,
almost.
right, and they have their own way of doing things. The best practices in Windows will be a little different than in Xbox was completely different when I joined long back, and same in Azure. So my question to you is, because you've been through all that, what are the best practices you follow in your team? Practices which you will never compromise on. And there are some practices, yeah, that's, it's all in gray between, practice A and practice B. You can choose, doesn't matter. So
Sure.
talk to me a little bit about the best engineering practices you follow in your team to do the development of these
Yeah,
complex big products like Xbox.
I've really honed them over the years. What I found is it's best to keep it as simple as possible.
Mm-hmm,
So I try not to have too many different things that my team needs to get good at.
mm-hmm,
Just a few skills that I want them to be great at. So there's two pieces to this, and both of them have been proven out through studies. There's a book called Accelerate.
mm-hmm.
I recommend for people who are really into, I want to see the data behind this,
Right.
about what makes a difference for teams. And they did, I think it was like a 4-year study of software organizations across the globe,
Mm-hmm.
looking for what was it that made the biggest difference.
Right.
And it very much aligns to the practices that I've been using for decades now.
Mm-hmm.
So the two things that they really focus on in that book, and I kind of categorize the things that I like to focus on. One is inspirational leadership, or what they
Mm-hmm.
call transformational leadership,
Mm-hmm.
and that's a lot of the things that we talked about: setting a vision, setting clear boundaries for your team so that they know, if I work in this, I can innovate, I can take risks as long as I'm within these boundaries. The kinds, all of that stuff. Along those lines, the two things that I particularly like that stand out, other than just having a vision, the basics that we talked about. One is this thing called an options portfolio, which it would take me a while to describe to you, but I've written about it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just a planning instrument which is a fancy word for saying it's about 2 pages. It's very short.
Uh-huh.
It just puts all the different work that you could do over the next 6 to 18 months, and just puts it in a 2x2 kind of matrix or table,
Right.
that lays out all the different things you could do based on how risky they are.
Mm-hmm.
And the low risk items are the things that you're already doing to run your business. The next most risky items are the things you might be working on next. And the next most risky items are the things that are, out there.
Right.
And I found this planning tool, which again is nothing but, a 2x2 table,
Mm-hmm.
to be, or I guess 3x3, but whatever.
Mm-hmm.
It's just really simple to do. It takes very little effort, and yet I've found it to be invaluable in planning. So I really like the options portfolio. And again, I've written about it, so you can look up the details.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing that for inspirational leadership, go ahead.
Sorry to interrupt. So in options portfolio, are you prioritizing the features, what you will be doing, or you have 2x2 and you are putting what is important, what is urgent, things like that?
So the two dimensions of the option portfolio are one, up and down, is how difficult is it going to do? Is it to do? And then left and right is how sure are we that our customers want it?
Okay. Oh, okay.
So the two different elements of risk.
Yes.
The two different elements of risk.
Mm-hmm.
And what you do is you try and have a balance. You try and do a balance of things that are, how to do them, but we're not sure the customer wants them. We know the customer wants them, we're not sure we can do them.
Mm-hmm.
we don't know if the customer wants them. We don't know if we can do them, but wow, that would be really amazing. That could really change things. And then, of course, our customers want them. We know how to do them. That's our basic, that's our basic stuff.
Okay.
So that's what the options portfolio is. And by having a balanced portfolio, you got all your things covered. You're going to be able to run that business over the long term in really interesting ways for your customers, for technology, while still maintaining your current customers. So and your current business. So I really like it for that. It doesn't talk much about prioritization. Obviously, your basic business, of course, keeping your basic business running is always a top priority.
True.
But for the rest of it, you can kind of see what happens over the course of that 9 months, 6 to 18 months. You can really see what's happening, and always be prepared to respond, because you'll have thought through, the kind of things that could be happening. Obviously, you can get surprised during that time, of course, and add things to your portfolio, but I found it really helpful, and it doesn't take much effort to put together.
True.
And then in terms of specific prioritization, that you just set based on, okay, what's your overall organization trying to accomplish in the next 6 months? What's that larger frame of planning? And the options portfolio can really inform that. And then you can take the prioritizations from that planning exercise you do with a larger organization to dictate what the priorities are for the, just the upcoming period.
Okay, perfect. And you were talking about the inspirational leadership after that.
Right.
Yeah.
So the second thing there that, again, there's very few of these that I do. The second one there that I really like are skip one-on-ones, which may not sound like it's related to inspirational leadership, but it really is. This is where, part of inspirational leadership, transformational leadership is coaching. And part of it is being clear about your vision and driving your vision throughout the organization. And one of the best ways to do that is to be talking to every individual in your group. So that includes the people, not just the people directly reporting to you, but the people reporting to them, which are these skip one-on-ones. And it's a great opportunity to help people grow, to give them feedback on their careers and all that sort of thing, to answer questions, to relate things back to the vision, of course, to coach them up on any areas that they're concerned about or they're struggling with, and also areas that you've heard from other people on your team, from people across groups, where that person could really develop. I found skip one-on-ones to be incredibly valuable. And not only that, but of course I learn as much as the skip does, because I learn what's happening on the ground and what experiences they're having, what's top of mind for them, what's being most challenging for them. So I find that practice to be just incredibly valuable. And then the other side of this is just lean. So lean practices, which are related obviously to agile practices. Lean practices are incredibly valuable, and there's 3 of them that I really emphasize with my teams, and I've gotten it down to just these 3. There's lots of other things you can do that are super great, but these 3 seem to be at the core. And those are Kanban, CI/CD, continuous integration, continuous delivery, and DevOps. Those 3 things are at the core of what I've been pushing with my teams, again, for easily the last 10 years or so. I've been doing all 3 of these things. I was pretty early on Kanban. It's pretty early on continuous delivery as well. Continuous integration has been around forever, of course. And then and DevOps to go with the continuous delivery. Those practices really seem to differentiate, again, with the research, but also in my experience, really seem to differentiate the high-performing teams, the teams that are super responsive to their customers, super responsive to changing market, and also high quality, sustainable effort. And they just do the best. So there are other things like test-driven development and pair programming, and there's a laundry list of agile practices, industry practices that you could throw in there. But what I've found is that those three, Kanban, CI/CD, and DevOps, really seem to be difference makers.
Perfect. Yeah. So you talk about agile and obviously lean, and we have Scrum there, Kanban there, and people have their own different definitions of these processes. So I would like to know a little bit if you can talk more about what kind of documentation happen when you are building a different product or if adding a feature. Do you have a BRD, like business requirement document, functional spec, tech spec, and all these documents are there? Or because I hear in some team, they say, we are agile. We are, gonna just write code straight and show you what's happening. And some team do still want to have functional spec, tech spec, because I do believe there has to be some direction where the code is heading to. So what's your take on that? How much documentation you do for a product before you start development?
Yeah, so a couple different things about that. Whenever I think about any form of communication, and documents are a great example of that, you always want to think, what's the purpose of that communication? What's the purpose of the document? And who is the audience, right? Who is it being written for? In order to have something that's worthwhile, that's actually going to add value. So when it comes to things like specs or architecture documents, design documents, things like that, you want to think about, okay, what is their purpose and who are they for? With lean, when you're dealing with small self-directed teams, whether they're Scrum teams, they're using Kanban, whatever they're using, if you have small teams that are co-located, and they could be co-located digitally, where they're constantly online with each other, or they could obviously be physically co-located, something that's a little difficult right now with the pandemic and all that. But if they are just working with each other all the time, and they're constantly in contact with each other, then they don't need as much documentation that serves the purpose of having them all on the same page. That's not as necessary because they're constantly in contact with each other. And if they're following the lean principle of having small pieces of work that they do to completion and then do the next piece of work, then there's not that much time that's passing by that you need documentation to remind everybody of what they're working on, because again, they're doing that piece of work to completion and then moving on to the next thing. So they don't need that in-depth, detailed reminder of what they're working on. So those purposes of the documentation aren't important anymore. So you wouldn't do it for that. So why would you have documentation in the case in which you have a co-located small feature team that's constantly in contact with each other? When do they need documentation? What I find is they need documentation when they're pulling an item off the backlog. That could be a Scrum backlog, could be a Kanban backlog. They pull an item off the backlog and they assign it to someone, and that person isn't sure what to do. Right? What is the next thing to do? How does this break down? Is this going to take a month? Is this going to take a day? Is this going to take an hour or a few weeks? I'm not sure. What are the requirements around this? How is it supposed to work? What's in scope and out of scope? I'm just not sure. I can't break this down. I can't estimate this thing. I don't know what it is. Right? There are items on the backlog. That's not an issue. Everybody knows exactly what that is. It's a competitive feature. We have the competitive feature. We're just trying to do something similar. It's a super straightforward bug fix. It's a whatever, right? For those things, you don't need squat. You don't need documentation for those. Everybody knows what it is. You just move forward. You could easily break it down, get to work. But there are other items. Wow, I'm not sure what that is. I don't know how it would break down. For those, you need a spec. You need to actually spend the time to think about it. And now that becomes the work item is, let's write a spec on this thing. Let's review it with other people. Let's figure out what those issues are. And then we can move forward. And so that's when I want to document.
So when you say spec, you will have a functional specs, maybe separate functional spec, and then a tech spec where we're talking about how we'll implement it.
Yeah, I'm talking about thinking through in a documented form that people can review and read.
Right.
That answers the questions that need to get answered before I feel confident about moving forward.
Okay.
That could be a tech spec. That could be, kind of like a PM spec. That could be, any number of things. It depends on what the item is. What's confusing about that item that's allowing me to not have confidence about moving forward.
Mm-hmm.
Whatever it is, I need to work that out.
True.
And I need to review it with other people to make sure that I'm not crazy,
mm-hmm.
and that I'm on the same page with those people.
Mm-hmm.
And then now, once I have confidence, okay, we all agree, we know what this is, we know what it's supposed to look like, we know what the trade-offs are, I know how to break it down, I could tell you about how long it would take,
mm-hmm.
we're ready.
Right.
And you can put any label you want on that document, but that document is serving that purpose for that audience.
For that audience. Okay. So I think you gone into very much on the lean side, because often we in Microsoft also I seen, and even in my current company, I do that. I define the what we will be building, and that I call functional spec. Now this functional spec is just 2-3 pages or 4 pages maximum. It's no more 120 pages, which we used to have. So it's very, very lean functional spec, which talks about what, and then we'll have a small technical spec, which talks about what we will be doing, which is talking about interfaces and functional parameters and things like that. So these are just 2 documents. But what I am understanding from you, you are saying, don't worry about all that. Have a small document which can answer what and how both to whoever wants that. So if you have that document, that's good enough documentation, and move on. Right.
Yes, exactly right. Because the customer is never going to see that doc.
True.
Right. They're going to experience, the software that you deliver, right? The service that you're delivering. They're going to experience the product. It's not whatever document. So that document, its purpose in life is to help you deliver that experience. Right. And anything that's superfluous to that, you're just wasting your time.
Okay, perfect. Good. So my next question is, which is, again, I saw a pendulum swinging in both directions, even in Microsoft, in other places too. I see that there will be a team, and there will be a team just for front end. They just do the UI work. And then there will be a team, which is the backend team. They just do only the databases and API. And then often I see in some places where we'll have just one team, which does everything vertical, UI, backend, API, everything. One team will do. So in your experience, which combination you feel is better? This layered approach, horizontal, or this one vertical team is having everybody together?
So it's an interesting question. So first of all, I really like, as I've already expressed, I really like having small feature teams, multidisciplinary feature teams that own, a small set of microservices or some components or the UI, like you're describing, whatever it is. Right. I like the atomic unit to be a small team. And by small team, I mean anywhere from 4 to 8, maybe on the bleeding edge, like 10 people that are all working tightly together. They'd be co-located if they were physically located together. They'd be online with each other all the time if they're digitally connected. That's your feature team. So that's the size team that we're talking about. And I'm going to assign that team ownership of the code base. Because one of the interesting things, and then I'll get into, okay, but is that front end or back end or whatever? But before we get into that, I want them owning a code base where they're the ones who are controlling that code base. Other people aren't touching it except through pull requests that they would then code review and make sure that it matches what their intent is for that code base. They really own it. And the reason why that's so important is that some years back, some researchers in Microsoft Research wanted to know where the source of errors were in the code. What causes bugs, basically. And they did a whole bunch of analysis, and they looked for things that correlated well with buggy code. And it was just the kinds of things you would expect. There was, the complexity of the code. There was code churn, code that was being changed a lot.
Right.
There were a whole bunch of different things that seemed to align themselves with where code was buggy. But the number one, far and away, the number one thing that best correlated, most accurately correlated with buggy code was multiple teams touching the same piece of code at the same time.
Mm. Yep.
And they were looking over millions and millions of lines of code. That was the clearest indicator, was if multiple organizations, multiple different groups, different teams were touching the same code.
Mm.
So since I don't like buggy code, it's a problem for everybody, customers, ourselves, right, the business. What I want is my small feature team to own their code. No one else is touching it unless it's through them, a PR that's going through them, right? So they should own the code. Now, at the same time, it's really awkward to own a piece of code devoid of your customer, devoid of a scenario, right? Mm-hmm. Even if your customer is another group and you're providing them an API, right? And you want to own a scenario. Now, obviously, there's a limited size of scenario that a small team is going to own, but they should own a code base that has contained within it at least a few smaller scenarios, so they can kind of own the end-to-end experience of at least pieces of what their customer would experience. Mm. And that seems to be the sweet spot for me, because it's a hybrid. It's owns the end-to-end experience, and yet it's a fixed set of components that they own entirely. Mm. Mm-hmm. And that seems to be the sweet spot for me. Now, naturally, there will be scenarios, end-to-end scenarios, that cut across multiple of these services or components, these multiple teams. But there will also be verticals that just fall within that one team.
Right.
And that seems to be the best of both. Now, obviously, it depends on what you're working on as to whether or not, how much of the back end and front end that's gonna be part of, right? If it's purely a web service, well, there's probably not as much UI, right? If it's a website and there's a piece of a web service and the team owns the website plus a little bit of web service, perfect, mm-hmm. right? Mm-hmm. If they own a web service and their customers are other developers are calling into that web service, they can own that experience. If it's purely a back-end thing because they're doing the scheduler for the operating system kernel, God knows what, right? That's also some scenarios that they can own. Right. And they can drive quality through that, they can drive experience through that, and they can still be in touch with their customers while working on, obviously, scenarios with other teams that are much larger.
Right. Okay, perfect. I think we got our answer, and feature teams are much better, I feel, because there's a sense of responsibility is also there, because they mm-hmm. know what they're building, what customer is going to see. Because I see in some scenario where I have this platform team or a framework team, so they're building a bunch of widgets, and they don't know who is going to use it, and when the end customer will see this, and then after some reorg, that framework team is gone now, and leaving the framework. Now, the scenario you were talking about, bunch of team is trying to use that framework and nobody owns it, or multiple people touching it, and it's really a breeding ground for bugs. So that's right. This is a good takeaway to understand how to compose teams to reduce your bugs and keep devs motivated too. So my next question is, you just wrote an article about the DevOps, getting to the DevOps culture. So I would like to get a few tips from you. A traditional shop which is having dev, test, PM, release manager, and then the ops people, and then they used to release things like that. Now from there, if you are a old traditional way of dev shop, to move to this DevOps culture, so what are the few things we should be careful about, and how the transition should take place? Like if you are an advisor and I am asking you how I take this shop, which is a traditional shop, to a DevOps culture.
Sure. Well, the way to think about it, because of course you want this to go smoothly, and you want people to have lives, right?
Sure.
And you want to also continue to improve your product and services, even after you switch to DevOps, where people aren't just taking care of the service. So it can go badly if you don't do it, in an appropriate way. So the critical thing to understand with DevOps, and the way that I think about DevOps is when the people who write the product are also operating the product.
Yes.
They're also looking after it and servicing it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And they're doing that on a daily basis because, that's the way software is these days. Everything's changing very fast.
True.
So if you expect that to happen, then the first thing that occurs is someone just flips a switch and says, okay, everybody, we're going to fire the test team, the operations team, and the dev team is going to own operating, validating and operating the service. And we're going to start that on Tuesday. And, boom, it's Tuesday. Tuesday is going to be a train wreck.
Yes.
Everyone's going to have a horrible time. And that's because there's all these things that the operations team and the test team were looking out for and taking off the dev team's plate. And the dev team is just going to be overwhelmed.
Right.
So those experiences become terrible. And what ends up happening is you end up just dedicating people on your team to being those testers and operators.
Right.
And they call it, they call it a rotation of some kind. And those people are just doing that all day long, every day. And it's awful. And you do a rotation. It's just terrible. It's a terrible experience.
True.
A much better way to do it, a much smoother way to do it, is to say, okay, how would we make this sustainable? Sure, someone's going to be on call, someone's going to be on rotation, but how are we going to make their lives reasonable where they can continue to contribute to the product? They're not going to be awake all hours of the night for, however long their shift is. How do we make this reasonable for those people? We're never going to be perfect, but how do we make it reasonable? And the way we do that is step one, you got to get rid of your technical debt. Okay, all the bugs, all the manual steps, the manual deployment, anything that requires a huge amount of effort because you workarounds, fixes, reboots, God knows what it is that you're doing that requires hands-on work, that requires those operations people to spend time doing it. How do you get rid of that stuff so that it's a reasonable experience when you're the one on shift? You got to get rid of that stuff. Now, that takes a huge amount of effort. So it's unreasonable to wait too long to make that happen. Right? You can talk about it, hey, we're going to make the product a lot more reliable. We're going to improve our quality. That's enough to sell it to your higher ups. But there's a limit on how long you can spend doing that. So all you're trying to do is get it to be like 3 out of 5 days. 3 out of 5 days, things are going reasonably smoothly. Right. That's all you want, right? It doesn't have to be perfect, but 3 out of 5 days, things are okay. I didn't have to do much, okay? I didn't have to do too much. And then 2 days a week, maybe they're not going that great, okay? And the weekends are pretty quiet. That's kind of what you want. It's unreasonable to make it, 7 out of 7 days. But things are pretty reasonable on the weekends, and 3 days out of a week, that's not asking too much. If you can get there, now it's not going to be overwhelming. Okay? The next thing you need to do is you got to get yourself to microservices, because the whole thing with DevOps, to be in DevOps, is the dev team, and again, it's a small feature team, right? It's taking care of their own service. Right. Well, 6 to 8 people aren't going to be able to take care of this huge monolithic service. They're not going to know every aspect of it. They're not going to be able to deliver it on a daily basis and get to continuous delivery and all those great things that you want to get to. They're not going to get there. It's just too complicated. It's this massive thing. Yeah. So what you got to do is you got to refactor into microservices. And once you remove the technical debt enough that you can, most days it's fine. Okay. Right. And you're in a microservice, now you can be DevOps. Now you can have a small team own that, actually regularly deliver it. It's not overwhelming. They can make it happen, okay?
This is a very good point. Nobody talks about this to do a microservice before you go to DevOps. They will talk about a lot of other things. And it's such a common sense thing when I hear you that, yeah, I should have a microservices. So people who own sliver of the responsibility of that whole service should be able to handle it. So this is a very good point, that to have a microservice architecture before you get into DevOps word as such.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, obviously, you can, again, you can, if you're the executive, whatever, you can say, too bad, we're not going to go to the microservices. Your life, you know, you, Joe, and you, Sally, whatever, you're on shift today, and your lives are going to be freaking nightmare for a week. God bless. Take care of everybody for everything. And all you're going to be doing, all those poor people are going to be doing is calling up other people and waking them up. It's going to be terrible. Right. If you've got microservices and your debt is, you know, it's not completely gone, but things are reasonable. Well, now you're going to be able to handle that. And each team is going to be handling it. It's not, you know, Joe and Sally's jobs aren't, you know, their lives aren't going to be awful. And, you know, you'll be able to handle it. And then once you're into that thing, and now you're doing DevOps, now you can start going to continuous delivery. Now you can constantly be iterating based on customer feedback. Now you're living the dream. Right, which is that last step of DevOps, is really getting that continuous delivery. But you can't get there unless you get rid of the debt, or at least enough of the debt that things are reasonable, and you're working in microservices.
True. And I think adding good monitoring and having a good log management will help a lot once you flip to the DevOps side, because these are the two tools you need when you are woken up at 3 a.m. at night. You should know exactly where to go, what to look for. So the log management and monitoring is another one very important things.
Yeah. And if you're curious about learning about more of this, you know, like you said, I recently wrote an article about this called Switching to DevOps, and it talks all about this. And it's not a long article, but it talks about it in a bit more detail.
Right. No, I'm going to put all the your article URL in the description of this video. And I like your articles because they are small, 2-3 pages, and they give you a lot of insights. In fact, I learned so many things from your articles when you were writing this hard code column in Microsoft. Every month, I think we used to get some newsletters from you, and it was very, very interesting. And another interesting thing, I think people will see your picture on those hard code column, which is completely different from your personality. Because they put some, you know, different funny pictures there. So I will highly recommend people to buy the book Hard Code, or there's a blog also where you have all the articles published there, and they are very, very interesting to read about a lot of different things in management and how my internal Microsoft used to work. So that